who could summarize for all of us the most important points from yesterday's class? Was war wichtig?
We talked about the states in which Christianity appeared, Roman Empire, Judaism, and so on, the Greek culture. We also talked about the sources. We can go back to the primary non-Christian sources, the secondary Christian and non-Christian sources, and so on. And we talked about the apostolic fathers and other sources.
That's true. Anything else that we can add or expand?
For me, one interesting thing also was that the apocrypha texts aren't texts that are like that we refuse, but just texts.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily. But texts that didn't make it into the canon because not enough churches were using them.
Very good. Anything else? We also talked a little about Gnosticism and talked about complications with the term and how the concept can be understood, and we said that it actually could be understood in various ways to encompass both what we know as mainstream or orthodox Christianity, if we understand it certain ways, and it can also embrace all sorts of other things that are very different from the mainstream Christian view. And we also we stopped here when we started discussing those who provided, those early Christian authors who provided apologetic works in defense of Christian position or their understanding of the Orthodox position against all sorts of different things. One of them, we said, was the need to answer to the accusations coming from already ancient Romans, and we illustrated that with some of those accusations. And one concrete example we find in this author, Celsus, who actually very explicitly tried to not only accuse Christians of various things that we already encountered in other authors like immorality and atheism and so on, but actually to mock Christianity and Christians openly. You can see what was his approach to Jesus. And also when it comes to Christianity, he was pointing to the foolishness of the Christian message, that basically it is a kind of superstition directed at people who are unlearned, ignorant, and that the whole faith or philosophy or movement was immoral. That unchangeable, but there is a typo here, so it should be immoral. The unchangeable God cannot become mortal and changeable. So this is one of those challenges that was posed very early on against Christians, basically trying to counter Christian message with a certain philosophy and say, well, look, if you follow closely, logically, the claims that Christians advance, there is something terribly wrong about their reasoning. And one of those things is this one: how can this God, if he is absolute, if he is unchangeable, become mortal, become one of the humans and die? And similar kinds of objections to Christianity you can see later on as well. In the modern period, you can find many philosophers who advanced those charges against Christianity, about unreasonableness of Christianity. And of course, we said that some of those early authors were directly trying to provide arguments against those accusations and positions. Others were also trying to provide a much bigger rationale for Christianity and Christian faith. One of those famous ones is Justin, who, after going through various philosophical schools, trying to find true teaching, actually ended up in Christianity and tried to provide a rationale which would harmonize philosophy and Christianity. This would remain a big challenge. We mentioned that also yesterday, that some of the Christian authors already in the early period, Justin was one of them, tried to show that actually you can use philosophical language and philosophical concepts for the purposes of explaining and expressing the faith. Others, he was also one of them, would go even farther and say, well, actually you find glimpses of Christian truth in other philosophies and other teachings, but Christianity is the true philosophy. All the philosophies, in other words, culminate in Christianity. And you would also find positions that are exactly on the opposite end. Both positions and everything in the middle belongs to Christian tradition and Christian authors. Those who would say, no, philosophy is essentially something different, and actually philosophizing faith or Christian theology bears an imminent danger of ending up in some of the heresies. So, since I'm sure that you already know the basics about these authors, I'll just very briefly go through some of those most important authors. Some of them were actually starting already in the 2nd century to provide a rationale, some philosophical or theological arguments, if you will, for conceptualizing the basics of Christian doctrinal system, including triadology and doctrine of Trinity. Irenaeus is, of course, one of the major figures in all this history, who was one of those who explicitly attacked Gnostics, and we owe to Irenaeus those ideas about Gnosticism that we couldn't actually expand on before those original texts were discovered, like Nag Hammadi collection. And that leads us to this important question that we started discussing yesterday a little bit, but we should expand more on that. The question, why were these early authors and Christians and Christian church in general, why were they all so preoccupied with the question of the correct profession of faith? The question might seem stupid enough. So why? What do you mean why? Yeah, they wanted to know what the right profession of faith is. What's wrong with that? But if you keep in mind what we said about ancient Rome and those pagan traditions, we said that they were not very much concerned with the question of how do you believe, correct doctrine, correct profession of faith. We said that, they had various mythological narratives, but they were not canonical. Even some of the foundational narratives, like when you go to ancient Greece or ancient Rome and you ask a simple question, how come that the world was, came to be, they had different narratives. If you ask them about even Rome, about the foundation of the city of Rome, they didn't have one narrative. There were some more popular, and there were others. And if you believed that, actually one of the ancestors of Romulus and Remus was this one, and another was somebody else, that was fine. So they were not concerned with the issue, you must exactly believe in this, not something else. Why was it so? Why ancient Romans and Greeks and many other religious systems just provided, they were very flexible when it comes to what people who follow these beliefs, what they believe and how they imagine all sorts of things related to their religion. And yet now Christians were so obsessed with the idea that we need to nail it down, we need to be very precise. Who is this God? And then we come to the concept of Trinity, but then it's not enough even to say, well, it's a Trinity and Triune God, but there are these persons, and then the question, but how are they related? And then they clarify how are they related, and then they further clarify, okay, but who is this Jesus Christ? But then, and then you go on and on and on, and of course, in that process, you produce all sorts of heresies, and then you counter-fight them, and you have different proposals, and then you have ecumenical councils that condemn them, and all sorts of things that did not exist in some other context. The question is, why? What is that different? Is there something structurally different in Christianity that made Christian authors and these early theologians to spend so much time and energy on discussing issues that would seem, if you looked at that from the perspective of ancient Roman religion, would just seem totally useless. Like why? Why use? And okay, you believe that Christ is this, okay, fine. You believe Christ is something else, fine. Why ancient Romans could afford to have such a flexible doctrinal system up to the point that there was no actual doctrinal system, and Christians could not. They were trying to be very specific about it, and that gave birth to Christian theology.
Because the goal was different. The goal of Christianity is knowing God and knowing the truth about God. But I think, as we said yesterday, for the Roman Empire, it was just important for the people to believe in like almost the same things for the social part of it, and not really knowing the truth. I mean, there isn't really a truth there, if I can say it like that. But in Christianity, like the base and the goal is different.
Okay, so there is this important proposal. The goal of Christianity is different, and your answer to that is different because the goal is knowing God, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other suggestions, proposals, or disagreements?
Yeah.
Does anybody disagree with this, that that's the goal of Christianity?
I think what she said is the correct answer, because the goal of the Roman Empire is at the time, I think, to extend their political and geographical area, and not and they took this flexibility in religion as a way to extend their political goals.
True, but the same could be said about then later Christian states.
Yeah.
That they also used their understanding of Christian narratives just as a political ideology, expanding their empires. And you can say that every empire does that. But the tricky part is that if you ask ancient Roman priests of their religion whether your religion is true, they would of course say yes. So what we do and our gods are true. So in other words, it wouldn't suffice to say, well, Christians insisted on the truth and being somehow in touch with their God, and ancient Romans or anybody else didn't. Actually, everybody in these religious systems, almost up to the point you can call them traditional religious systems, everybody tries to be in touch somehow with their gods. That's not an issue. But the issue is there that there is something in Christian goal, if we can call it that way, that was different to ancient Romans. The central question there is, and that's how Christianity is different. It is one of those systems, and we call it salvation religion. And Christianity is, and especially for early Christians, they accentuated that it was and it is about salvation. There is, in other words, a perception that the state in which we exist in history, that there is something wrong with that. And that that's not the whole story, the whole picture, and that our relationship with God is not just, or is not primarily, or is not at all, depending on who you ask, among theologians, about sustaining this life as it is, or prospering in this life. That's a very important distinction. Many other religious systems have, as we saw, structurally speaking, many similarities. We talked yesterday about what we can find in mystery religions and how many parallels we can find between that and early Christianity, and why, in the eyes of an external observer, what Christians were doing and saying could have seen as very similar to what some other cults were practicing. But in Christianity, not only in Christianity, of course, we talk about salvation. And ancient Romans really didn't have a kind of metaphysical or temporal understanding of salvation. The goal, as we said, was to take care of what's happening here and now. And the relationship with their gods was primarily to secure what was called pax deorum, peace with gods, so that you keep gods happy and they do what they are supposed to do and you do your side. That's why the question there was not, what was crucial was not the orthodoxy, the right profession of faith, but what we call orthopraxy, orthopraxis, or the right way of doing things. And ancient Romans and many other ancient peoples were very attentive to how they do their rituals. Do you participate in those rituals? That was important. Do you participate in those public expressions of faith? Public spectacles, chariot games, offering sacrifices. That was the way of keeping gods happy. If you do things correctly, you believe in your head whatever you want. But there is a way in which you become member of the community, and there is a formula how you do things, and gods will be happy. If you don't do it correctly, there was a danger that gods might get angry and you get into trouble. Here, of course, the thing is how you do things. It will become, of course, important, and you'll study that. How do you serve liturgy? You cannot just serve it to any way that comes to your mind. But the question of orthodoxy, the right profession of faith, becomes extremely important, because that salvation comes through faith. It's a big topic, but we are just outlining it here. And you are getting to, in connection with true God, and coming to the salvation through safeguarding correct faith. Because correct faith, correct doctrine actually preserves you from idolatry, from believing and relating to false gods. That's why the issue of doctrine becomes extremely important. And that's why they were arguing to those very, very, very fine, it seems fine details and almost completely abstract philosophical ideas, but you can draw serious conclusions based from them. A typical example from a much later period, of course, would be filioque, a huge dispute between East and West, the insertion in the Western profession of faith of belief that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. or via the sign. Okay, you can then dispute those translations and what they meant by that. But, and many would say, well, this is really something where theologians who don't have anything better to do with their lives, they then sit down and endlessly talk about, nonsensical things. You agree on this and that, who cares, is it this or that, how does it reflect on what you do? But you could claim that actually it does have implications as to how you think both about who that God is, how he relates to the world, and what's the purpose of the world in the end. So what is the salvation of the world and how comes it? And of course we can talk in this context, and if we have time we can talk more about it tomorrow. This up to a point tension, up to a point compatibility between pistis and episteme, between faith and knowledge. But as you can see in Greek, there is even at the etymological level a connection between these two terms. And faith in Christianity is not something that at least many of the early church authors were not understanding in that way. Something that's contrary to knowledge and reason. It is something that's compatible with that, but in many ways is superior to it. So it goes back to Paul and his definition of faith, and of course then it's elaborated in these various authors. One of those, of course, who from the early period contributed to the development of Christian theology was Clement of Alexandria. And he was one of those who was accused of producing something that becomes too abstract, too philosophical, that almost becomes a philosophy, and its relevance for Christian life was not necessarily immediately seen. And you have that since the very early period up to now. You very, very often see in the life of the church and Christianity this tension that some theologians are accused of just getting too much into theoretical discussions that bears no relevancy as to the life of their congregation, and you will have some of those who say, no, we need to take care of the practical things and forget about philosophizing too much. And there are of course those who would say, well, how do you know how to take care of practical things if you don't think it through first? One of those who is, I'm sure you're familiar with, one of the greatest theologians ever, and a teacher of many of the influential figures, is Origen. And he of course he contributed to almost all fields, as they would later become known, of theology, giving comments on scriptures, and also offering this kind of tripartite way of interpreting scriptures, saying that it is not necessarily a choice between a literal understanding of the text and an allegorical or metaphorical, but actually you can understand it in layers. So that would be used and recycled many times later on, and will become relevant again in the 16th century and after, when focusing on the scripture, in particular Christian traditions, becomes central. Then we have Hippolytus, another author who already produces works in the 3rd century, of course, AD, which becomes a very interesting period in the history of the Roman Empire, because that's the century characterized by the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, when Roman Empire was basically collapsing. And many historians offered interpretations that all sorts of new teachings started to emerge and be spread around because of the social and political situation. Now, what was the 3rd century crisis, and how we can talk about it some other time, but it is the context in which one important thinker pagan thinker appeared called Plotinus, Neoplatonic philosopher, and if you continue studying theology, you will come across his name often, because he offered a philosophical system that so much resembled what Christian theology, developed Christian theology, especially triadology, was talking about, up to the point that someone who is not trained in Christian theology, if they just know something vaguely about Christianity, and they take and read Plotinus, they might confuse that with Christianity. But of course he wasn't Christian, and he wasn't producing Christian theology, but structurally speaking there are many similarities and probably interferences between his approach and Neoplatonic approach more generally and those early triadologists. And of course we have another important figure, Tertullian, who came up with this idea that one substance is what characterizes this one God and three persons, and that there is one person who possesses two natures. So this will, as you know, this is a topic that will continue to be very acute over the next couple of centuries. Another author that you might know, Cyprian. Some of those authors, as you might know and as you can see from here, actually ended up outside the Orthodox doctrine. So some of them ended up being condemned by the church, which tells you also an important thing about Christian theology. First of all, from what we can see when we look back at history of important authors and saints, is, as we said, if you aspire to find a complete coherence and agreement on all things, even doctrinal things, among various authors at various times, try, but it won't get you far. So you try, but you'll be coming if you read them, what's written and understand what they meant, but then you'll find a lot of differences. So you'll find sometimes that some of them took exactly the opposite positions on various questions, and both ended up being saints. You can find those examples. That's important to know, that actually all of this theological discussion, although doctrine is important, but that doesn't mean that agreements need to exist on everything, or that we within the church need to produce some kind of ideology that everyone needs to conform to, and if you don't conform to, you better watch. There should be a difference between some kind of other doctrinal ideological systems and Christian theology, that very often in practice there is no difference, it's a separate matter. So you have that from the Christian tradition, and you also have a situation where some theologians contributed a great deal to Christian theology. Parts of their works are appreciated, became part of the official doctrine of the church, but they themselves were condemned for various reasons, or ended up outside the church. So it's a complicated thing, and we shouldn't try to simplify it and make it into one simple, coherent narrative. There are, as you know, very many Alexandrians in this early period who decisively contributed to the development of Christian theology. Of course, you heard the name of Ignatios, and he is one of those central figures for the early history of the doctrine for Christology. But what is important here is not so much to go into the work of these individual authors, but rather to reflect about the time when they worked. Athanasius worked now in a different context compared to these earlier authors. What was different about the time of Athanasius as opposed to the time of Irenaeus or time of Origin or others? Just one important thing was different. There are of course many different things, but one was crucial. What is that happened in the 4th century that changed the history of the world? Before Kirchen, there was no, first of all, there was no this separation split, and as such, it would come later between East and West. But there was a division between East and West, but toward the end of after his time, toward the end of the 4th century. What happened right at the beginning of the 4th century?
It might be because they started to organize ecumenical councils. The first one.
Constantine the Great, and his arrival on the stage of ancient Roman state and of the world. Why was Constantine the Great important?
Because he managed to unify all Roman citizens, Christians as well as non-Christians, and like he did that by organizing the councils, like putting them, like trying to get them together by any means.
Okay, let's spend some time on that because that seems to be one of the points that we should clarify a little. Prior to the time Constantine the Great comes to power, let's say 312. Yeah. And prior to his time, what was happening in just a decade before in ancient Rome was something extremely important for the Christians. Yeah. That's something.
Like there happened many persecutions, but Constantine the Great, like did the Edict of Milan, how by which he stopped the persecutions of Christians.
And also it's important to say that in that time, before Constantine, the Roman Empire was divided into 4. I don't know what the name.
Yeah, there were four parts. But let me just unpack that a little. We won't spend much time on that, but this is quite important because that would change the church and Christianity and the world's history, at least history of the West. But because West was becoming very important, the face of the rest of the world as well. So prior to that, at the end of the 3rd century AD, as I said, Roman Empire over the course of the 3rd century experienced a lot of crises. Some of them economic, political. There were so many. There were in this period a couple of times more emperors than there were in the rest of Roman history combined. So they were literally sometimes parallel to one another, sometimes staying in office for 6 months, 1 year, and stuff like that, which speaks about the instability of the empire. There were civil wars. There were those emperors who were basically generals who were fighting each other. And Diocletian came at the end of the 3rd century and stabilized Roman Empire, unified it. And then came up one of the things that he tried to uproot, and he also seemed to perceive that one big part of this whole disturbance had to do with Christians, as again those who were not obedient or reliable citizens of the Roman Empire. He tried to finish with that problem, and that's how he launched what's arguably were the worst persecutions of Christians. Not just localized, not just in certain cities, but more general. But he managed to stabilize the empire, and then he came up with this idea to split up the empire into basically 2 parts ruled by 2 Augustine, two senior emperors having one Caesar each, who were meant to succeed then and become Augustine later on. This system was short-lived, so Constantine then comes and he fights against Maxentius, and then he manages to unify and become emperor of the western part, and then eventually also of the entire empire. But what was important, it's a complicated story about Constantine and his conversion and all of that, but what was remarkable is that he came in 313 with this Edict of Milan, where he granted freedom not only to Christians but to everyone, so that everyone, as the edict says, can believe as their heart wishes, which was a pretty remarkable thing if you keep in mind what was happening just a decade before. And many argued then, and we read Eusebius and others, how he was pious and how he actually respected Christianity and the church. What were the reasons behind that? It's a complicated issue. Some Christians would argue that, of course, he was Christian, but we know that he eventually might have converted on his deathbed, so he wasn't, in that sense, a member of the church. It seems from everything that we know that for Constantine there was no really much difference between the solar God and this God that the Christians talked about. His mother was Christian, so that might have been one important source of influence, but some other historians were trying to find in Christianity itself the reasons for this decision to actually grant freedom to Christianity and then promote Christianity. When people mistake is very often made when you read all sorts of things, and then people say Constantine the Great made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He did not. He is just a mistake. He was one of those, the chief one who was behind the Edict of Milan. Lactantius was the other. But what the Edict of Milan was saying is that it would grant freedom to all religions, but specifically accentuating Christians in the church, that actually property should be restored to the church. So it is true that he supported the church, and he would continue supporting the church over the next decades, but he wasn't making Christianity the only religion of the Roman Empire, let alone official religion of the Roman Empire. That would come at the end of the 4th century under Theodosius I. Then Christianity would be installed as the only legal religion. All other cults would be suppressed and persecuted. Constantine was not there. It was still supporting the church, but not making it the only official religion. Some propose that Christianity had certain things that other religions in Roman Empire didn't. What might that be? That might have made Constantine opt for Christianity instead of something else. This is pure, of course, speculation, because there is no way of knowing. But it's a good exercise, so we can think about, was there something in Christianity that could have been much more useful for an emperor and Roman Empire in such a state that would give it advantage over other cults?
Well, once a week the Christian would gather to pray with each other, and they live in harmony with each other. And for an emperor who wants peace for his Roman Empire, he would like or would love that everyone is a Christian, so they all can live with each other and with that kind of peace and love. So it was a strategic strategy.
But why not just choosing some other cult and making everyone follow that cult, and then they live in peace?
Because people maybe rebel.
But why shouldn't they rebel?
Because Christians were peaceful.
Oh yes, that's what Christians like to think of themselves, as everybody else. That is one proposal. Is there anything else?
Maybe because the God of the Christians is teaching them to be obedient, and even to be obedient to the state, and not to be rebellious.
Well, if you ask John and you read the Revelation, John would say, well, don't be obedient to the beast. Actually, no. The Christ is there to bring the beast, and the beast there clearly stands for Roman Empire, the state, to an end. Yes, some other theologians, Eusebius, would certainly agree with that. Be obedient to state and all of that. But many Christians would say, no. And if you read Christ's words from the Gospels, there is not much there that would make you think that he was in favor of, let's just be obedient to the state. But it is a suggestion that eventually it ended up that way, that actually the church and the official doctrine actually was not the one of rebellion against state, and you can see that already from previous times. Actually, just before this time of Constantine's supposed conversion, there was one important Christian author, Lactantius. What did I say before? Did I say Lactantius or Licinius is what I wanted to say? Yes. Licinius was the co-emperor. I made a mistake. So Licinius and Lactantius was a theologian working at the turn of the century, writing at the beginning of the 4th century, and he was before Constantine. He continued, of course, living it, writing, but some of his major works come before Constantine, when the empire was still pagan, and he was providing a rationale, and he wasn't the first one, who was saying, actually, that's the kind of mindset. You stupid Romans, if you could just see that actually what we are talking about is true Romanness. He was, in a very smart way, providing a theological rationale to say that actually there is no contradiction between Christianity and Roman Empire, that actually what Christians talk about Christianity is basically calling Romans to go back to their ancient customs and tradition, because these come from the same source and they fundamentally agree with Christian message. So there were those theologians who already before Constantine were kind of trying to harmonize Rome and Roman preoccupation, especially when faced with persecutions, and Christianity, and that would increase once, of course, Constantine came to power and started supporting the church. And most of what you have after that history of Christian thinking about the political, most of it, not all of it, was about agreeing between the church and the state, between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of... you don't ask me what I think about it, but we can discuss it at some other time.
I'm just imagining now, if I'm in his position from a political perspective, I would say, in Constantine's position, I would make the same thing again, one more time.
Why?
Simply because something looks like, I'm not sure who said this sentence, probably Hitler or something. He said, give me an army of volunteers, I will invade the whole world. And no one else had seen how much the Christians have been persecuted severely before the time of Constantine. So they are the only ones who are coming from under the pressure, and they are the only ones that could sustain the peace of the empire.
As Jews.
And
ancient Roman
and yet also still growing, a growing community. Nevertheless, they're getting persecuted, but they're still growing even more and more.
That is an important factor. We are not, of course, sure about the percentage, but it was growing. It was growing significantly. It was still not not even close to becoming any kind of, in itself, similar factor, but there are some proposals that already by the late 3rd century, beginning of the 4th, Christianity was deeply rooted across ancient Roman classes. So from the top, that some were either openly, but most of them crypto-Christians, and others were, of course, they are among the soldiers, among the poor people, and all of that. So that might be one factor.
To add, there's also a universality in Christians. And you have Christians from Syria, Christians from Egypt, from Greece, from everywhere. And if you would unify all of them, you would unify all those.
That is, and that seems to be the single most important factor. Of course, all these important historical events, they hardly ever have like one source, but it's always different things. But if we were to point to one single factor, that probably would be that. If you think about ancient Roman religion or other cults, or not even ancient Roman, think about ancient Judaism. They were in different ways, but they were localized, local phenomena. Judaism was global phenomenon of that era. Jews were trading and were living all over the empire, but it was in a certain sense, it was reserved for certain ethnicity. That was the mindset. So followers, of course, you could convert to Christianity, to Judaism, but in principle, it was the followers of certain, not just doctrines, but actually descendants of certain patriarchs. So one tribe or multiple tribes coming from one patriarch, they belong to this faith. And if you are of some other origin, you don't belong to it. So it was very specific to one culture, one language, one ethnicity. When it comes to ancient Greek and Roman religions, you hear about Zeus or Jupiter or other gods everywhere, but actually they had their local manifestations, and that's why very often all these gods have some attributes. So you hear about Athena Parthenos. Sometimes it's an indication of a specific function these gods were performing somewhere, and sometimes related to their places. It was very difficult to use any of them and unify the diversity of cults that existed. Christianity, in that sense, had a couple of advantages. Unlike Judaism, it was not just oriented to a specific ethnicity or culture. There, Apostle Paul is very clear, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither male nor female. We are all equal. So that message was extremely radical. And if you think about it, even now, we like to think of our time in our context as terribly enlightened, open-minded, embracing, and tolerant, and all of that. But that message, if you try to apply it even nowadays, and see what happens, what happens to you and everybody else who tries to apply it. Try to apply in practice the idea that all human beings are fundamentally equal. You'll end up in not very nice places very soon. We like to say that at a rhetorical level, but we don't like to practice it. We constantly, in all the societies, discriminate between various classes, between various kind of who is citizen, who is not a citizen. Citizens have these rights, others don't have. Then even if you are a citizen, but of a different origin, then it doesn't necessarily mean that in practice you are equal to those who are of quotation marks, natives or this and that. So even gender discrimination, not to mention that. So in a certain sense, what Paul was advocated for, calling in the 1st century AD, still remains as an ideal that hasn't been reached.
We find it even in Orthodoxy itself, between Orthodox Christians themselves. One could say, one says, well, he's Coptic, well, he's Serbian, if he's not a Greek, he cannot be Orthodox. He's not that. That's a problem.
That kind of nonsense is there all the time. But at least like at the level of doctrine of how it should be, be like that. But many of the official ideologies actually openly would discriminate against people, and many people wouldn't see actually any problems with. Nowadays, it became unpopular to advocate supremacy of various nations for obvious reasons and right reasons. But on the other hand, many people won't see any problems with having different social classes. They'll just see it as natural. Yeah, sure, we are certain people are supposed to be where they are and run the show, or be super wealthy, and others don't, and so what's the problem with that? So in a certain sense, Paul was attacking even this. You can read his message, of course, strictly in theological terms, talking something about how we relate to each other if we are Christians, and how the church should be constituted. But it also has social and political implications, very radical ones, for the time and place where social classes were extremely important. They are important even nowadays, but back then it was very important whether you were coming from an aristocratic family, old one, or from family of slaves. When there was a gender discrimination, so that women were not actually part of society in any sense in which men were, and so on and so forth. And now something happened over these couple of centuries up into the fourth. Because of that, some claim that was a distant appeal of Christianity. Because if you were a slave at that time, you could become a member of the church. If you were a slave owner, you would become a member of the church. If you women, men, doesn't matter, different cultures, different origins, different languages, everyone was welcome in the church. So that certainly had an impact and had a universalizing potential, and that's what Constantine probably needed, stabilizing the empire that was previously fragmented with many different disagreements. Christianity now came. You couldn't use Judaism. He could have used some other cults. Some mentioned Mithraism that we talked about just briefly yesterday, as another cult or religion that was very popular, maybe even more popular at the beginning of the 4th century than Christianity. But there were some problems with in this sense, with Mithraism that Christianity didn't have. So, for example, it was just exclusively male cult. So Christianity had even there an advantage. So that might be, together with this phenomenon of growing number of Christians, what might have made Constantine opt for Christianity and support Christianity. Some even claim that these reasons are behind his interest in church councils and church affairs. There are some theologians, Christian theologians, who claim that Constantine was a very learned theologian and was very much interested in doctrinal issues. But you can also read his interest in the church along these lines. That when he summoned the First Ecumenical Council, that the primary reason behind that was to actually stabilize the empire and end the disputes that were threatening the empire with another fragmentation. So this is the context that totally places the church in a different situation. So instead of being persecuted, instead of being something alien to the Roman Empire, it all of a sudden became visible, a desirable partner. The emperor himself and his family support the church, part of the family are Christians. There is a lot of money being put into the church, a lot of property restored, so a lot of financial support. And that completely changed, and bishops became, in practice, state officials. So all of this, in a very brief period of time, changed the rules of the game, as it were. And that would have significant implications for how the church functioned, but also how Christians started to relate to their environment. As one famous Catholic theologian put it, Hans Küng, very briefly, less than 1 century, the church of the persecuted became the church of the persecutioners. So those who were suffering and were persecuted, church Christians under Roman Empire, became those who started persecuting others, either those heretics or pagans or anybody else. And the reason why the church and church people were in that position was now because they had state behind them. Otherwise, that wouldn't be possible.
Can I just? There was a metropolitan who said something concerning this, really remarkable. Can I read that?
Yeah,
Like it's very interesting. He said, when, however, after the recognition of the church in the time of Constantine, it became first of all permissible to be a Christian, and then fashionable to be one, then the community changed completely. Thousands of people probably threw themselves into this Christian church because it had become the church of the emperor. As there was no danger and no personal commitment to God in the same degree of risk there had been before, there was also less commitment of one to another.
Very well. Very well, yeah. Thank you for that. It fits very well the discussion. And some similar thing are parallel. Of course, historical contexts are, you can never compare them directly. It's always different. But if you think about the situation in many post-communist countries, it's comparable. Because in many communist countries, the church was persecuted and either was forbidden officially or unofficially. It wasn't popular to go there. Many people were murdered, many people were imprisoned. But once that regime ended, it became again fashionable to be part of the church, to say like, oh yeah, I'm Christian or I'm Orthodox or I'm whatever you give in context. And then it gives you all of a sudden all sorts of social advantages. And very often that you ended up, that's we are talking about the end, in this case, of the 20th century, so not that long time ago. Many people noticed that many of those ex-communists who were convinced atheists and running the show in the communist times became big believers overnight. Sometimes just to keep their positions and to continue with occupying influential posts. And this is also something that up to a point was happening in Constantine's time. So that's why we should always think about what is that when we say Christianity. And we are discussing here early Christianity. We can actually understand this concept. No, please go ahead. It doesn't matter. We can think about the concept and understand it in various ways. One is when we things that are related directly to, let's call it, theological part of the whole story that has to do with doctrine of salvation, with faith, with all those sorts of things. But Christianity also, in given historical moments and in a broader social context, can mean something else. It can mean an ideology. It can be mixed with state doctrines. It can be mixed with many things that, in the language of the New Testament, belong to this world. And we should be attentive, never just to automatically accept everything that goes by the name of Christianity, because many non-Christian, even anti-Christian things can be called Christianity. But shall we make a break now? Yeah? What do you feel like? 10 minutes sharp. Okay. Okay, so what I would like to do now in this first part of the second part of today's meeting is just to finish with these couple of names from the early period, not so much for the sake of going through their particular theological interests and works, but rather to address and unpack a little bit another question, and that is, when did this time that we call early Christianity or early Christian authors or church fathers, when did it end? So when we talk about early Christianity, then we can ask simple questions. Okay, so we started discussing yesterday when were those beginnings of Christianity, and we saw that it wasn't that easy to answer that question, but we could offer multiple answers. But what about this, the other end of the same question? So when did this period end that we call early Christianity? And then related to that, the period of the fathers, church fathers.
Maybe when the church split it into multiple what's this one? Catholic to
But when, for example, was the split between what would become known as Roman Catholic and then Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Church?
Officially, it was 1054. I think.
Yeah.
The
So it was 11th century. So would it mean that until 11th century we talk about early Christianity? Very improbable.
I don't think so. I think it is only for.
Which is also true that in the mean before this, what is called the Great Schism, that there were other schisms, as you are very well aware of them. Different church councils where before them or after them there would be huge disagreements and then splits within the church into various branches. So
I think it depends
on what
on
or
like
who.
by which perspective you're seeing it. Like if you ask a Coptic or Armenian, well, what is early Christianity? You would say like the fathers before Chalcedon, the pre-schism fathers. If you ask a Catholic, you might say before second schism, like the Great Schism. I think
That's true. All these, like more or less any of those big periods or eras that we give certain names to, they are conventions. You can talk about early Christianity pretty much as something that happened before great church councils when all of the doctrinal issues were clarified. But then again, that speaks to this point who you ask, because it looks a little different when you look from the perspective of pre-Chalcedonian Christians and those who accept later church councils. And the same goes for also the age of the fathers. Pretty much in the West, all this period that we talked about, including these figures such as Ambrose and Jerome in the West, of course Chrysostom, Augustine, would be church fathers, and even as late as those figures who played a decisive role in formulating theology of icons. And then you would count after them different period. But you can also just simply call the entire period of church history as the period of various church fathers, and nowadays we also use the word church mothers as well. So prominent theologians who played an important role in either contributing to the formulation of the dogma or clarifications of certain theological issues in various times. So from that perspective, it wouldn't really make much sense to discriminate in a fundamental way. You can of course discriminate in the sense of the level and say, okay, these are much more important because they contributed more, or the depth of their theological insights is greater than the others. But it would be hard to defend a position why, for example, someone who contributed to the hesychastic polemics just because they're from a later period, wouldn't be church fathers, as opposed to someone who clarified other issues back in the 4th or 5th century. And you could say that for also later period. Claim that even take into account the 20th century and amazing developments that happened in Orthodox theology in the 20th century and probably will continue, I don't see any reasons why, from a historical perspective. Of course, it is very difficult to talk about it when it's happening in real time, but from a historical perspective, that some other future Christians may not look back at these periods and identify certain figures who would be granted this status. But generally, we can, as we said, divide the whole story about Christianity and early Christianity based on those various criteria. If you follow general history, you can talk about the pre-Constantinian period as something quite different from the post-Constantinian period, because the church found itself in a very different situation. You can also take the first big major divide, such as Chalcedon, as a decisive point, and then count early Christian time prior to that, and then something else, and so on and so forth. So there are various methodologies in which you can approach this issue. And of course, you can also just approach it, strictly speaking, theologically, and derive Christian history into basically periods when certain issues, theological issues, were discussed. The period when the formative period, when the basic questions of Christian ethics and doctrine were posed, the period of Trinitarian theology, the period of Christological issues, and so on and so forth. So, what I would like us to focus on now is similar and yet a little bit different issue. And that is the question of how we think about the church. Because we started discussing yesterday the question, what's Christianity, what's early Christian period, how do we date it, what's constitutive for it, what are the early writings, who are these early authors, what kind of issues were posed and answered in questions posed and answers given in this early period, what was the political context. And another big thing that we should address is the question of what's church? Is the church something equivalent, concept equivalent to the concept of Christianity? Were the beginnings of the church the beginnings of Christianity and vice versa? Let's spend some time thinking about it. Yeah.
I think all the church really says is that it is a community of believers who strive to follow the teachings of Christ and have the same goal. And it is not tied to a building, for example, or because sometimes people had, like, when there was Christian persecution of Christians, they had churches like in their own homes. So it was really just coming together and praying together and having the Eucharist and all of that.
This one possible answer. Any other? Yeah.
If you see it in a spiritual sense, you could say it's a continuation of the life of Christ on earth. Like,
what would that mean in more practical terms?
More practical terms would mean that Christ did not leave anything on earth, anything written, something like that. He did leave a group of fishers, of sinners, prostitutes. So he did leave that on earth, so that they might be an icon of Christ, or the continuation of Christ for all the world. So, like, yeah, that was it.
Good.
Yeah. If we talk the Bible as a reference for us for this question, you can see from Paul that he told us, in his letters, that remember me the church at your home, and a lot of context. And also Jesus, when he sent the apostles, he told them, go to every city and have go to their home and have the God's words there, and I think this was the beginning of constructing the churches.
I would say, first of all, the church is the bride of Christ, and second of all, we are the church. We are the people, we are the Christians, we are the church, because without us, the church won't, the church will, like, that's my
Yeah, I mean, all these answers are answers that you also find in church tradition, theological tradition. The question is, where does the word come from?
Ecclesia, Greek, assembly,
Meaning?
assembly.
Or those who are herausgerufen. Is that herausgerufen?
Yeah, called.
Called out.
Yeah, called out.
I think it's the word.
This and this is interesting because the first question we can ask is this term was this term used exclusively for Christian purposes?
No.
Yes.
But
I think every cult or religion that saw themselves as that had assemblies or that saw themselves as a chosen group could call themselves a church. Maybe. Probably not.
but not all of them would.
I would say no, only Christians, because in Matthew 16:18, Christ, when he was talking to Peter, he told him, upon this rock, in Greek it's ta Petra, talking about himself, I would build my ecclesia. So it was
You're already preventing papal claims.
no,
Okay.
I think the first church was the people of God, which was Israel. First people of God, like they called themselves the ecclesia, the church between all those who were called out of all those people, like the Gentiles.
In a certain sense, yes, that they do. Do you have, conceptually speaking, of course, although they wouldn't use the same word, simply because they wouldn't use at the beginning of that story Greek, but the concept is there of a certain calling. God calls a certain patriarch or group of people into a kind of special relation to follow a special path. But the concept itself is actually, and that's interesting, is coming from the political vocabulary of ancient Greece. So, ecclesia means assembly, political assembly. In ancient Greece, that was something equivalent to a parliament, where issues would be discussed, where citizens would participate and make political decisions. Ecclesiasterion is the place where the church, but of course not Christian church, but a group of people, representatives of the people of a certain city-state, would come together and discuss things. It was used also for the assemblies of Jewish people that we also use the concept of synagogue, which is also comes from Greek, and they could have been used as synonyms. So this is something that was then taken into the Christian context, and we can think about why, for example, not really all of those cults could fit this description. We talked yesterday a little bit about this element of initiation and secrecy, but then this concept, the very concept of the church, would actually imply something else. It would imply this public dimension, public outreach. Some claim, and this is now becomes an interesting topic, we won't go more into that actually the reason why this vocabulary was used and the implications of it had to do with the fundamentally political and social dimension of the early Christian movement. So that there was this public and political dimension that goes together with the very concept they used to characterize the church, that actually played quite a prominent role. So it is a separate issue, because that of course contradicts what we usually think about the church when we look at it specifically from a theological perspective as something that primarily has to do with issues of salvation, of God, of faith, of prayer, and so on and so forth. But there is a lot of that language that's very political in the early period, early history of Christianity. Even when you just read, it's not just the church that's a concept that's used from political vocabulary. There are many other political concepts that were used to actually sometimes express many articles of the faith. So, but we'll leave it at there. There is, of course, another term that is used, but in a different sense. So, ecclesia would remain the term that implies this community. People coming together, gathering together. After these initial couple of centuries, it would be huge public gatherings. Not, of course, primarily for the sake of making political decisions like in ancient Greece, but rather for the sake of the celebration of Christian rituals. And that would be the primary meaning of the church, coming together. But the concept of Kyriakon is another concept that implies something that belongs to God, of the Lord. And in that sense, it could be related to the house of the Lord. Another word for that would be temple or church, in the sense of the place where the church as a community comes together. And of course, this is the concept that would penetrate into Western languages. So both English and German and even Slavic languages, kind of their concept of the church have to do with this one at the etymological level, not with ecclesia, although they are used for both. And we find those concepts already used in the Gospel. So in Matthew, the line that we just heard about building the church, and also we find another concept. So of course this is not from Matthew 16:18, the one below, where instructions are given how to deal with those who sin or are doing wrongly, and then as the ultimate test prior to treating them as pagan or tax collector is tell it to the church. So if the church if they refuse to listen even to the church, then treat them as pagan. So in a certain sense, church there, and you can see there maybe also implications of the concept and its prior use in the political context, and the church remains as the supreme authority, but now meaning this assembly of the faithful as the supreme authority where decisions should be made and where someone should reconcile with each other and with the church as such. There are probably also some implications there from a Jewish context, because you have the entire Jewish tradition also talking about the community and what happens there in mutual agreement as something that has supreme value. Of course, it's much more then developed in the rabbinic post-temple Jewish theology, and you have those nice stories and parables where they would even contrast abstract factual truth to the decision taken by the community in mutual agreement. There are some jokes about it when rabbis discuss and then who's right, who's wrong, and all of that. But the point of some of those stories is precisely to tell, no, we reach an agreement, and when we reach an agreement, that is the most important thing, not whether you are objectively speaking right or wrong. This is interesting. It might sound strange, and it is strange because if you think about it, it can have very grave consequences. If you apply it blindly, that would mean that the church or hierarchy has the power ultimately to decide on anything. And then you end up in those bizarre historical episodes where you have scientists saying, well, look, guys, the sun really doesn't revolve around the earth, but rather the other way around, and you can see it unless you're completely ignorant, and then you burn or something because it disagrees with the church doctrine. So that would be really a perversion of this principle. It shouldn't mean that. But from a Christian theological perspective, that tells us something about the, let's put it, that hierarchy of values and hierarchy of priorities. The idea is there that unity among the believing people is something that comes first. That belonging to the community is a Christian way of constituting the truth. So the truth, Christian truth, is not primarily about some facts. It's not primarily about some knowledge that you can objectively or rationally arrive at. Christian truth is constituted in a community. And of course, that truth is Christ himself. So it's not about some kind of abstract things. That's why giving priority to the community becomes so important, and that's why traditionally, and some claim, it's an interesting topic to discuss, we don't have time to unpack it here now, but some would claim that the primary reason why certain heresies were condemned and why certain people or groups were excommunicated was not, and of course it's questionable, but maybe you can argue in some cases, that the primary reason for that was not different teachings. Because from the very beginning, as we saw, there were different teachings. But the moment when you start splitting up the church, there becomes something that becomes problematic. Now, when you put it in different historical periods, it's you find very little of that in actual practice. But as a principle, it has validity. There is some meaning to it. That once you start splitting up the body of Christ, as church is referred to, the community being together, that actually endangers, in a very fundamental way, Christian truth. And Christian truth, and we can talk about it much more some other time, is about being together and constituting this new identity as part of the community. So it has all sorts of implications, not some abstract truth. So as long, one might say, as long as you have certain ideas about something, but you still remain in the community, and even if you disagree, then ultimately you reach an agreement or reconciliation with the community, that's fine. But if you start getting out of the community and church as a community, that means even if you're objectively speaking right, what you're doing is contrary to the Christian understanding of truth as something that happens only in the community and is not truth of rational nature. It is truth, existential truth, so to speak. It is a way of iconizing Christ and the church and ultimately eschatological community. So the second, of course, thing that in this context we should mention is the concept of liturgy. And that, again, is something that has to do with public service or public work, and is not a concept that, again, is exclusively Christian, but nowadays, of course, we use it primarily for Christian service. And in that context, also the Eucharist, Thanksgiving, that came to signify either liturgy as such, or part of liturgy, central part of liturgy, when we are offering bread and wine and gratefulness to God for everything, which becomes the focal point of the whole service. So what would be the relationship between liturgy and church?
So church is a place where liturgy occurs, or how? The church is a place where liturgy.
Mm-hmm. So you can understand it, yeah, the church is a place for liturgy. Any other ways of understanding the relation between the two?
And nobody can understand liturgy outside the church.
Mm-hmm.
Liturgy, the basics are the basics.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Any other proposals?
I think you can say the church is made in liturgy, like it's offered up because it's the body of Christ, it's the body of the Lord, which is offered up. So we are also offered up, and so it's also like liturgy cannot take place without the church.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
like without look. It's like it's the word even says public work, the work of the people. Like if there is no people who are offered up, there cannot be any liturgy.
But interesting question is, can you have a church without liturgy?
No.
So does it mean that it's basically two words that relate essentially to one and the same thing?
It depends also from which context
Mm-hmm.
one is asking about this.
Yeah. So what are the possible contexts? What is the context where basically we can say that, church and liturgy is one and the same thing?
The Christian context.
From the Christian context.
Yeah, you can make a claim that, and as some, of course, it can be misunderstood. So one always needs to clarify the point. But there are theologians who claim, it is the Eucharist, it is the liturgy that actually makes the church, not vice versa. And you can say that actually the real identity that the church, where the church manifests itself as the church, is in offering thanksgiving and the Eucharist. And that everything else that we can think of when we use the concept of the church is kind of secondary and derived from that. But that this is the primary meaning. And if you approach it that way, it has all sorts of interesting consequences, because then you take into account then the definition that we gave, that a church is primarily a community of believers. But not just any community, because believers can form different communities and can come together for various sorts of purposes. I mean, if you come together to watch, football or something, that kind of vaguely can be something that has to do with church assemblies, but that's not where the church and how the church fully manifests itself. But a liturgical gathering where the church comes together, the believers, in order to serve the Eucharist, becomes the place where the church is manifested as the church. And what it also means is that everything something that does not have a place in liturgy does not fundamentally, in some sense, belong to the church. So the church is then this reality that actually is being taken into communion with God through liturgy. And that allows you then at the same time, it seems as a very reductionist definition of the church, so to identify with liturgy. But if you do that, it all of a sudden becomes also a way to embrace virtually everything within the concept of the church through liturgy. Because when we gather at a liturgy, it's not just about people who are there at that moment. That's why the liturgy commemorates everyone and everything. We remember Christ's first coming, and we remember his second coming, and all the saints. But what we also do is basically praying for the entire world. And even more, we are then bringing bread and wine as those pieces of material or material reality. So in a certain sense, liturgy, defining church primarily in terms of liturgy, becomes a way in which you include the entire universe into this communion with God. Because everything should find its place there. And thinking that the Eucharist is something that is just something that is about us, specific group of people, is the first sign of a sectarian mentality that actually is counter the whole spirit of the church and Christianity as we know it from this tradition. That's what you find very often among certain communities and even those who call themselves Orthodox. This is just for us, and we are going to be saved, and we don't care much about the rest of the world. So it is important that we are kind of exclusive club that enjoys being together and excluding everybody else. That's not the church, from the way, at least, in which majority of what we call Orthodox tradition, how we see from that perspective the church. We see the church is there because it includes and is open to everyone and everything. And by everyone and everything, I really mean everyone and everything. So one theologian, 20th century theologian, even said, well, if this insect that is now in front of me, if that insect is not with me in the kingdom of God will be poor, will be incomplete. So liturgy is a way of including, embracing everyone and everything, not just all human beings, but if you will, all the planets and the satellites and fish and everything else. So that is this universalism which is manifested precisely if you become a parent, if you approach the church as thanksgiving, as liturgy, as Eucharist. Because that's what priests and what we do ultimately, they are the liturgy. That's the text of all these different liturgies are actually reminding us of that fact. It's not about separating us into some small groups. It is about allowing for the entire God's creation to participate in the communion with God. So that's one way of understanding liturgy. And of course, and I'll finish with this one, because then we can save some time if you have any questions or comments to discuss more. We can understand this formation of the church, and some take the Pentecost as this birth of the Christian church. The question is why? because you can clearly trace back the Eucharist to the Last Supper. Very often that's the way it's done. And the formula there, that's what we also use, and it's used in most of the Christian writings about Thanksgiving and liturgy. Why then Pentecost would be also a way to understand the beginnings of the church?
Maybe because we said that the church is the union with God, and when the Holy Spirit descended on disciples, there was like this union.
Yeah, precisely because that's a way, a sign of saying this, what's happening in history, is not limited to history. So the liturgy has this openness toward, and that is this word that's very often used, especially in contemporary Orthodox theology, and misused as much as it's used, called the eschaton or eschatology. So the last things relating to the kingdom of God. So the presence of the Spirit becomes this way to actually say, well, what's happening here and now, paradoxically enough, has its origin not in what we do now, but what will take place at the end of history as we know it. So it has to do with second coming of God and establishment, second coming of Christ and establishment of the kingdom of God. So that is also a way to say, well, even when it comes to these foundational terms, as you can see from early Christian tradition and on, we don't have simple solutions and simple formulae that you apply. And I think that's very important. Never to be reductionist when it comes to theology, but rather not to be arbitrary either. So taking the logic anything goes, we can arbitrarily use different concepts, terms and all of that, but be open, because in a certain sense we also witness, when you go even to the New Testament text and the early history, not only that Christianity as such was gradually formed and actually continues to be formed, that's not also anything scandalous to say, but also the church. That because you can use the concept in these different ways, they are related to each other, but still can be used differently. In a certain sense, by the church, as we said, you can mean by that communion of God in entire creation. You can, of course, refer to a concrete group of people. You can mean by that serving the liturgy, all of these different things. So, and that is one of those things that is very difficult to tell what are the boundaries of the church, precisely because it is meant not to have any boundaries. You can also talk about God in a certain sense as another example of the church. Holy Trinity, Holy Three Persons, it's a communion of divine persons, so in a certain sense that's also a prefiguration of the church. And of course, ultimately, we can talk about the church in this sense in which most people in popular culture and outside Christian communities, what they mean when they say by the church is mostly church organization, administration, certain functions that certain people perform that we call the church, hierarchy, and all of that. But I will spare that for our tomorrow's meeting. Any comments, ideas, suggestions, disagreements, protests? Yeah.
I think. No.